So as we start to wrap up our discussion on the Romans, I said we weren't going to be here long, and I was right. There is one more stop we need to make. Just like we ended our discussion on the Greeks by taking a look at one of their most influential philosophers and theatrical critics in Aristotle, so too we've got to take a look at one of the most prominent poets, authors, and theatrical critics of the Roman era. Again, I know that during the course of these, I have made the Romans out to be these brutish, drunken, slovenly fools, and while that is not an entirely inaccurate description, it is not encompassing the people as a whole. The Romans had some very intelligent thinkers who penned some incredibly potent and important works, and Horace is among them. So Horace took the theories that Aristotle had first put forth about theater, and he took them one step further. Okay? Whereas Aristotle put these things down more as observations and things that he had determined by taking a look at what he deemed the best work that Greece had to offer at the time, Horace took these things that were, again, observations, and started putting them down and saying, no, these are not observations, these are rules. This is how theater needs to be done. You know, that concept that everything needs rules and everything needs standards. I mean, what is a sporting event if it has no rules or no laws governing it? What is a society without rules and laws governing it? So, of course, theatrical endeavors need rules to govern it. So Horace began using, again, the work of Aristotle as kind of a jumping off point, and then using his own research into Greek and Roman drama, and he began to develop what he felt were the hard and fast rules that theater had to follow. Now, what we see here, before we get into it and really look at these rules that he set up, what we need to point out is that this is the beginning of two rather disturbing trends that are going to take hold and are going to hold on to theater for centuries to come, some of which is still going on today, believe it or not. The first is this concept that theater needs rules, that a well-made play has to follow a certain structure. It's that belief that we even implement today, especially in the digital age, that everything has an algorithm and everything has a pattern. And all you have to do to make a good whatever, you know, fill in the blank, is just follow the algorithm, follow the mathematical probabilities, and you can do it. It doesn't take talent. It doesn't take artistic integrity or having a message to say. You just got to follow the beats. And this is a thing that is going to burrow into theater, and it's going to stay there for several centuries. As we go forward for the next couple of groups that we're going to be looking at, what we're going to see is there's not a lot of theater actually being produced, but there's a lot of theorizing going on about how theater should be presented. There are a lot of people saying, no, these are the rules. And then the next group comes along and says, no, these are the rules. And so on and so on and so on until we finally get to people like the absurdist theaters, epic theaters, things like that, who say, no, there are no rules and we can do whatever we want. So that's trend number one. Trend number two, and I've already mentioned it a second ago while I was going on that other rant, the second trend that pops up is what we are going to see a lot of as we move forward and up until about the Elizabethans, so that, in other words, the time that Shakespeare began writing. is there are going to be fewer and fewer plays that are actually being written for performance. That theater is still going to exist, but it's going to exist mainly in an academic standing, where instead of actually putting it on and doing it and creating things, plays are being written so that people can talk about them and discuss them in universities. They're being used to create all of these doctrine and all of these, great meditations. They're used as kind of the jumping off point for other people to make their points and to try to prove their own intelligence. But there is not a lot of theater actually being written to be performed for people to watch it. Okay? And that trend is kind of starting here. It wouldn't gain strength until the next point in history that we're going to be taking a look at, the Middle Ages. But that idea that theater is more of an academic thing as opposed to a living, breathing, artistic expression starts right here. So let's take a look at the rules that Horace said needed to be in place for theater to be considered pure theater or good theater. We're not going to go through all of them. I'm going to hit the high points, the ones that are the most important, mainly because, again, they are going to show up later on down the road. So let's take a look at these rules. So here we have just a few of the rules that Horace laid down and said that all theater should operate under. Now, as we go through these, what you're probably going to notice is that some of these seem very familiar, because a lot of these are either very similar to or are exact takeoffs from the elements of Greek tragedy that we've discussed. This is because that is, of course, what Horace was working from. He was looking at the Greek example. Of course, the Roman example just took what the Greeks did and turned the volume up on it a little bit. They did not vary the presentation all that much. There are a few key elements in here that the Romans contributed, but for the most part, these were taken directly from his study of the Greeks. So as such, you're going to notice some similarities between this and the elements of Greek tragedy. So let's take a look at some of these rules that he came up with. First, he says that comedy and tragedy must never be combined. So this had always been a bit of an unwritten rule, but it had never really been mandatory. If you remember back, Euripides, the most modern of the Greek playwrights, was known for mixing comedy and tragic elements. But it was not something that was done very often. But Horace says that no, those two genres must remain separate. The idea being that if there were comic elements in a tragedy, then the weight of what was going on would be reduced. And if there were tragic elements in a comedy, well, you're there to laugh at a comedy. Why would you want drama in your comedy? So this is going to be a rule. A lot of these are going to be rules that we hear echoed throughout the centuries, but this one is definitely going to stay in place for a very, very long time. The idea that comedy and tragedy must never be combined. Second, he says that a play should have 5 acts. Now, this is a contribution from the Romans. We talked about Seneca, who perfected the 5-act play structure. So Horace believed that that was the appropriate amount to fully explore the story. Now, as I've mentioned, in modern times, we have shortened it to 3 and finally to 2 in most instances. But the 5-act structure is going to be sticking around for quite some time. Here's one that should sound familiar to you. He says there are only 3 speaking characters should appear at the same time. Now, this was something born out of necessity for the Greeks. The reason why they only had 3 speaking characters at any one time is because they only had 3 actors per play. That was a necessity.
Horace says no. That is how it should be, because if you have more than 3 characters on stage, the audience begins to get confused, and you can't develop more than 3 characters at any one time. You notice that a lot of these, when we're going through various cultures' rules of theater, their excuse a lot of times is that the audience will be confused. Well, we recently saw a play that had 12 people on stage at the same time, and I don't think anybody was confused by it, but that's just me. Now, this next one is another one that is going to later take root and branch off into some other theories later down the line. The idea that the gods should not be brought in unless absolutely necessary to resolve the play. So you'll recall that in the latter days of the Greek theater, the Deus Ex Machina, the machine, had proven so popular that playwrights were writing it in where it wasn't necessary. And that gave rise, of course, to the term Deus Ex Machina, the excuse for the lazy ending. Horace said that we need to cut back on that, and the gods should only be brought in to save the day if it was absolutely necessary. He then says that the chorus, so the folks who deliver the prologue and act as kind of the audience surrogate on stage, the chorus should be used to forward the actions. So that's something they had already been doing. They were, providing the prologue, and they were on stage reacting to things. Set a high moral tone and give good sage advice. So now we're into something a little different. So now he is asking that the chorus stop being kind of passive observers and start acting almost like the little angel on someone's shoulder and easing them into proper decisions, or saying this is what you should do because it's good and mighty. And when the character, of course, goes against that good sage advice, that's when bad things happen. So this is a deviation from the way the chorus was used in Greek theater. Not by much, but it is a deviation. So these are some of the ideas that Horace laid out that he felt needed to be in place and enforced in drama. There is one other major theory that he put forth that is going to have a huge effect on how plays are written for the next several hundred years. Along with all of the other rules that Horace put down, and again, we're just kind of hitting the high points. There are more that he had, but these are just some of the ones, especially since they are going to be the ones that are going to influence things the most going forward. But he had one other theory that he believed should govern all plays, and that is the theory of decorum. So decorum, as Horace describes it, says that the language and actions of a character must fit traditional ideas of suitable behavior for their age, gender, social status, and emotional state. Let's read that again, and then we'll break it down to make sure that we're clear in what it actually means. So decorum, according to Horace, says the language and actions of a character must fit traditional ideas of suitable behavior for their age, gender, social status, and emotional state. So that is a lot of words. So what does that mean actually? So what this basically means is that the characters on stage, if we're going to, let's use some modern terminology to flush this out. What this essentially means is that the characters on stage must adhere to the culturally mandated stereotypes depending on how old they are, their gender, social status, rich or poor, and their emotional state. So, giving some examples, what this means is that if you had a king on stage, if one of your characters was a king, then that king had to behave in a noble, wise fashion, because that is what a king is supposed to do. The concept of an evil king or a dirty king is one for melodrama. But your main character would not be a evil king. It would be a good king. Same thing with knights. Knights would not behave in a dishonorable way because that is not the culturally mandated stereotype that they had of knights. That was not the public perception. Think of this list. Age. So that means you would not have a child speaking in a manner that would be more suitable to an adult. Likewise, you would not have an adult talking baby talk or acting childish because that's not what an adult does. So think of social status. Basically meaning that there are certain perceptions of the rich versus certain perceptions of the poor. A rich person is thought to be more educated, thought to be in a better place, thought to be nobler and wiser. A poor person is thought to have poor education, to speak in a manner that is broken and with sloppier pronunciation. You wouldn't have these things juxtapositioned according to the rules of decorum. Now, we know that, of course, there are kings that are unscrupulous. Of course, there are poor people who are wise and intelligent. But according to Horace and according to the rules of decorum, you could not represent those on stage because they weren't, A, closer to life, and B, if you did, it would confuse the audience. So again, there's that excuse that if you do something like that, the audience is going to be confused and not know what's going on. Decorum is going to be one of those lingering flagpoles that just kind of flutters over everything for the next couple centuries, and it's not going to be till the Elizabethans where somebody decides to chop it down.